When the rancher stopped breathing, the two Apache women kneeling beside him made a choice that would exile them from everything they'd ever known. They pressed their hands against the wound in his chest, felt the blood still warm between their fingers, and understood that saving this man meant losing their people forever. But they didn't hesitate, not even when they heard the horses approaching from the east, carrying the voices of their brothers who'd come to finish what they'd started. The older sister, Nalin, was 23 winters old and had never defied the council. The younger, Kiona, had seen only 18 summers and still carried the scars on her wrists from the mourning ceremony for their mother. They'd been gathering medicinal plants in the foothills when they heard the gunshots echoing across the valley. 3 shots, sharp and deliberate, followed by silence. They found him at the edge of Clearwater Creek, his horse dead beside him, his cabin burning in the distance. A white rancher named Thomas Garrett, bleeding out beneath the cottonwoods while smoke rose black against the afternoon sky. Their uncle, Chato, had led the raid. Nalin recognized his arrows in the horse's flank. She knew his reasons without asking. Garrett's fence line had crept 2 miles into territory promised by treaty. His cattle had trampled burial grounds. His presence represented everything their people had been fighting against for 3 generations. Killing him wasn't murder in Chato's eyes. It was justice delayed. But Nalin had met Thomas Garrett once before, during a winter when starvation had driven some of the younger hunters to desperate acts. She'd been tracking a wounded elk and found Garrett doing the same. Instead of claiming the kill, he'd stepped back and let her take it. Didn't speak, didn't ask for recognition, just touched the brim of his hat and rode away. One small mercy in a season of privation. She'd never forgotten. Now she and Kiona dragged him into the shallow cave where flash floods had carved out shelter in the limestone. They packed the bullet wound with yarrow and wild tobacco, bound it tight with strips torn from their own clothing. Kiona fetched water, while Nalin pressed her ear to his chest and listened for the heartbeat beneath the ribs. Faint, irregular, but there. Before we go further, if this story is holding your attention, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city or country you're listening from, because what these sisters did next would set events in motion that nobody, not even they, could have predicted. By the time Chato and his warriors reached the creek, the sun had dropped behind the western peaks, and shadows filled the canyon like dark water. Nalin heard them calling her name, heard the confusion in their voices when they found the cave empty, except for bloodstains and drag marks leading upstream. She knew they'd track her. Chato was the best hunter in the band, patient and methodical. He'd find them before dawn. She and Kiona had moved Garrett 3 times during the night, each time finding a new hiding place further from the main trail. They took turns keeping watch, while the other tended his fever. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words they couldn't understand, sometimes gripping Nalin's wrist with surprising strength and staring at her face as if trying to memorize it. Once he whispered, "Why?" and Kiona answered in English she'd learned from the mission school before it closed, "Because it's right." He closed his eyes and didn't ask again. The 3rd night, the fever broke. Garrett woke lucid enough to drink broth Kiona had made from rabbit and wild onions. He studied them both in the firelight, taking in their torn clothing, the exhaustion in their faces, the weapons they kept within reach. When he tried to thank them, Nalin cut him off with a gesture. Words didn't matter now. They'd crossed a line that gratitude couldn't uncross. "They'll kill you for this," Garrett said, his voice rough from days without speaking. "Your own people." "We know," Nalin replied in careful English. "Then why?" She didn't answer immediately. How could she explain that mercy wasn't about deserving, that some acts transcended loyalty to tribe or blood, that her mother had taught her to measure a person's worth not by the color of their skin, but by what they did when nobody was watching. Her mother, who'd been killed by white soldiers during a peaceful gathering, who died believing that hate only multiplied itself into greater hate if left unchecked. "Because you let me take the elk," she said finally, "when you could have fought me for it." Garrett stared at her. "You remember that?" "I remember everything." Outside the cave, an owl called 3 times. Kiona froze, listening. It wasn't an owl. It was Chato's signal, the one he used when he'd found fresh trail and wanted the others to close in. He was near, maybe 100 yards away, maybe less. Nalin made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She handed Garrett her knife, the one with the turquoise handle that had been her mother's. "North," she whispered. "Follow the creek upstream until you reach the fork. Take the western branch. 2 days' walk. There's a settlement called Magdalena. People there who'll help you. What about you? We'll buy you time." Kiona started to protest, but Nalin silenced her with a look. The younger sister understood. They'd made their choice when they stopped the bleeding. Now they'd see it through to whatever end waited in the darkness beyond the firelight. Garrett struggled to his feet, one hand pressed against the bandage wrapped around his torso. "I'll come back," he said. "I'll speak for you. Tell them what you did." "No white man's words will save us now," Nalin said. "Go." He hesitated, wanting to say more, but Kiona was already kicking dirt over the fire and gathering what little they'd carried with them. Garrett looked at them both one last time, then disappeared into the night with a silence that surprised Nalin. For a wounded man, he moved like someone who understood that survival sometimes required becoming invisible. They waited until his footsteps faded completely before Nalin turned to her sister. "You should go with him." "No." "Kiona?" "I said no." The younger woman's jaw was set in a way Nalin recognized. Their mother had looked the same when she'd refused to leave the gathering, even when the soldiers started loading rifles, stubbornness that ran deeper than survival instinct. "We started this together. We'll finish it together." Nalin wanted to argue, to command, to use her authority as the older sister. But she saw the truth in Kiona's eyes. Some bonds couldn't be broken by logic or fear. They'd stepped outside their tribe's law together. They'd faced the consequences together. When Chato found them at dawn, they were sitting beside the cold fire pit, weapons laid deliberately on the ground between them. An offering of surrender, or perhaps a statement that they wouldn't fight their own blood, even to save themselves. 7 warriors surrounded them, faces hard with betrayal and confusion. Chato dismounted slowly, his movements controlled, but his eyes burning with something Nalin couldn't quite name. Rage, certainly, but underneath it, disappointment. Maybe even grief. "Where is he?" Chato asked in their language. "Gone," Nalin answered. "Which direction?" She said nothing. Kiona remained equally silent. Chato stepped closer, close enough that Nalin could see the scar on his cheekbone where a cavalry saber had cut deep years ago, close enough to smell the cedar smoke on his clothing. "You've shamed our family," he said quietly. "Shamed our mother's memory." "Our mother taught us that every life has value," Nalin replied, matching his quiet tone. "Even the lives of our enemies. She also taught you loyalty, duty to the people who've sheltered and fed you, protected you." Chato's voice remained level, but his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "That man's people have taken everything from us. Our land, our buffalo, our children stolen to schools that beat our language out of their mouths. And you saved him." "Yes." "Why?" It was the same question Garrett had asked, and Nalin found herself giving the same incomplete answer because the whole truth was too complicated for words. "Because he showed me mercy once. because mercy is the only thing that breaks the cycle. There is no cycle to break, Chato said. There is only survival, and you've chosen the wrong side. One of the younger warriors, a cousin named Tarak, spat on the ground near Kiona's feet. Traitors, he said. Worse than the whites because you know better. You understand what we've lost, and still you... Enough. Chato raised his hand, and Tarak fell silent. The older warrior studied his nieces for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he spoke in the formal cadence reserved for council decisions. You are no longer of this family, no longer of this tribe. Your names will not be spoken. Your belongings will be burned. If we see you again in our territory, you will be treated as enemies. Nalin had expected death. Exile was somehow worse. To be erased from the only community she'd ever known, to become ghosts while still breathing. She saw Kiona's face crumble slightly before her sister caught herself and straightened her spine. They'd known this was possible. They'd chosen anyway. We understand, Nalin said. Do you? Chato leaned in close. You've traded everything for one white man's life. A man who'll forget you the moment he's safe. Who'll go back to his land and his cattle and never think of the 2 Apache women who died so he could live. We're not dead. You are to us. Chato stepped back, his face hardening into the mask he wore for war. You have until sundown to leave this territory. After that, my mercy ends. He turned and mounted his horse in one fluid motion. The other warriors followed, some casting backward glances at the sisters, others keeping their eyes deliberately forward. Within moments, the sound of hoofbeats faded into the morning air, and Nalin and Kiona were alone with the rising sun and the impossible weight of what they'd done. For a long time, neither sister spoke. They sat amid the scattered ashes of their fire and watched the light change on the canyon walls. Finally, Kiona broke the silence with a question that had no good answer. What do we do now? Nalin had been asking herself the same thing. They had no tribe, no family, no place in either the Apache world or the white world that had swallowed so much of the territory. They were between, belonging nowhere, carrying only what they wore, and the knowledge that they'd done what they believed was right, even as it destroyed them. We survive, Nalin said finally. The same way our mother survived, the same way our grandmothers survived. We adapt. To what? We can't go back. We can't go forward. There's nowhere that will accept us. Then we make our own place. It sounded brave when she said it, almost defiant. But Nalin knew the truth underneath the words. They were 2 women alone in a land that devoured the solitary and vulnerable. Their chances of lasting even a season were slim. Their chances of finding any kind of life worth living seemed even slimmer. But they'd made their choice. And Nalin had learned from her mother that choices, once made, had to be carried to their conclusion, no matter how heavy they became. They walked north that day, following the same path they'd sent Garrett on, but moving slower, stopping frequently to forage for food and water. Kiona had always been the better tracker, able to read sign in dirt and broken grass that Nalin would miss. She found rabbit runs and edible plants, located a spring hidden behind a tumble of rocks where they could refill their water skins. They worked together with the efficiency of people who'd spent their whole lives learning to read each other's intentions without words. On the 3rd day, they found Garrett's camp. He'd collapsed again about 10 miles from where they'd sent him, the wound having reopened during his flight. He'd managed to bind it again with his own shirt, but the fabric was soaked through with blood, and he was unconscious when they arrived. For a moment, Nalin felt a flare of anger. All they'd sacrificed, all they'd lost, and here he was, dying anyway, making their exile meaningless. Then she knelt beside him and checked his pulse, and the anger drained away. He was still fighting, still breathing, and they'd saved him once. They'd save him again if they could. This time they had no cave, no shelter beyond what they could build. Kiona gathered branches and constructed a lean-to, while Nahlin cleaned the wound and applied fresh poultices. They took turns keeping watch, sleeping in shifts, alert for any sign of pursuit or danger. Garrett's fever returned worse than before, and for 2 days he thrashed and muttered, lost in delirium. During one of her watches, Kiona asked the question that had been hovering between them since the exile. "Do you regret it?" Nahlin considered lying, offering reassurance. But Kiona deserved the truth. "I regret the cost," she said. "I don't regret the choice." "Even if he dies anyway?" "Even then." "I don't understand." "You don't have to." Nahlin adjusted the damp cloth on Garrett's forehead. "Some things you do because they're right, not because they'll succeed." "Mother used to say that." "She did." They fell silent again, each lost in memories of the woman who'd shaped them both. A woman who'd believed in impossible things like peace and understanding between peoples who'd been at war for generations. A woman who died for that belief, shot down while trying to speak reason to men who only understood violence. Maybe, Nahlin thought, they were more their mother's daughters than they'd realized. Maybe they'd been destined for exile the moment they'd inherited her stubborn faith that mercy mattered more than vengeance. On the 4th day, Garrett's fever broke again. This time when he woke, his eyes were clear, and his first words were, "You followed me." "You needed help," Nahlin said simply. "You should have kept going, should have saved yourselves." "We did save ourselves, just not the way you think." He didn't understand. She could see that in his face, but he didn't push. Instead, he tried to sit up and immediately gasped at the pain. Nahlin helped him ease back down, noting that the wound looked better, cleaner, the flesh around it less inflamed. "How far to Magdalena?" he asked. 2 days if you could ride, a week on foot in your condition." "We don't have a week." "We have what we have." Garrett studied her face, then Kiona's. "What happened after I left? What did they do to you?" Nahlin saw no reason to hide it. "Exile. We're no longer Apache in the eyes of our tribe, no longer family, just ghosts they hope to forget." The rancher's expression darkened. "Because of me. Because of our choice. I'll make it right. When we reach Magdalena, "You'll do nothing," Nahlin interrupted. "This isn't your burden to carry. The hell it isn't. Listen to me." She spoke with the force of absolute conviction. "What's done is done. Guilt won't change it. Apologies won't restore what we've lost. All that remains is moving forward." Garrett looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Nahlin's face stopped him. He nodded slowly, accepting what he couldn't fix. They rested another day while his strength returned, then began the slow journey north. The land changed as they walked. The red rock canyons gave way to rolling grassland, and the grassland eventually yielded to pine forests that climbed the slopes of mountains whose peaks still held snow even in late summer. They moved carefully, avoiding trails and settlements, trusting only each other. Twice they saw riders in the distance. Once it was cavalry, a patrol moving south with grim purpose. Once it was a group Nahlin couldn't identify, but something about their formation made her nervous, and they hid until the riders passed. The territory was full of dangers, both known and unknown. Every day they survived felt like borrowed time. Garrett grew stronger as they traveled. By the end of the first week, he could walk without assistance for hours at a stretch. By the second week, he was carrying his share of their meager supplies and helping to set up camp each night. He spoke little, But Nalin noticed him watching them both with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude, certainly, but also something else. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. On the 12th day, they crested a ridge and saw Magdalena spread out in the valley below. It was larger than Nalin had expected, with several streets of wooden buildings and what looked like a church at the center. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. People moved through the streets, tiny and distant, but alive with purpose. Garrett stopped at the ridgeline and turned to face them. "Come with me," he said. "Into town. I'll vouch for you. Find you work, a place to stay." Nalin shook her head. "That's your world, not ours." "You don't have a world anymore. You said so yourself." "Then we'll build one." "How? Where?" Garrett gestured at the wilderness around them. "You can't survive alone out here, not long term. And even if you could, what kind of life is that?" "The one we've chosen," Kiona said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken directly to Garrett in days. "You don't understand what we are now. Not Apache, not white. We exist in the space between, and towns like that," she nodded toward Magdalena, "don't have room for people like us." "You don't know that." "Yes," Nalin said, "we do." Garrett opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He knew she was right. They all knew it. Two Apache women appearing in a settlement with a white rancher would raise questions that had no good answers. Suspicion, fear, possibly violence. Even with Garrett's protection, they'd never be safe, never be accepted. They'd just be trading one exile for another. "So, what will you do?" he asked finally. "Head west. There are places in the high country where people don't ask questions, where being outside the tribes and outside white society might actually be an advantage." Nalin spoke with more confidence than she felt, but the plan had been forming in her mind for days. "We'll hunt, trade, survive. Make ourselves useful enough that people overlook what we are. That's not a plan, that's hope. Hope is all we have left." Garrett was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a small leather pouch and a folded paper. "This is the deed to my land," he said, offering it to Nalin. "Everything I own, it's yours now." Nalin stared at the paper without taking it. "Why would you do that?" "Because you saved my life, because you lost everything for me, because it's the only thing I have of value, and even that isn't enough to balance the debt." "We don't want your debt." "I know. Take it anyway." He pressed the deed into her hands. "The land is good. Water rights, grazing for cattle, timber for building. It's not much, but it's more than you have now. And the pouch," he indicated the leather bag. "There's money in there. Enough to get you started. Enough to have a choice." Nalin looked down at the deed in her hands. She couldn't read all the English words, but she understood what it meant. Security, possibility, a future that didn't involve constant running and hiding, and yet accepting it felt like accepting charity, like admitting they couldn't survive on their own. Kiona touched her shoulder. "Take it," she said softly. "Pride is expensive. We can't afford it anymore." She was right. Nalin knew she was right. They'd given up everything for principle. Now was not the time to refuse help out of misplaced dignity. She folded the deed carefully and tucked it inside her shirt, then took the money pouch and secured it to her belt. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. Garrett shook his head. "I'm the one who should be thanking you. Every day for the rest of my life." He paused, struggling with something. "I know you won't come to town, but if you ever need anything, if you're ever in trouble, come find me. I'll be in Magdalena, trying to rebuild, and whatever you need, it's yours." "We'll remember," Nalin said. They stood there in the fading afternoon light, three people who'd been brought together by violence and blood and impossible choices. Then Garrett extended his hand, and Nahleen took it, feeling the calluses and strength in his grip. Kiona shook his hand as well, and for a moment they were simply human beings, acknowledging each other's worth across the vast divide of culture and history. Then Garrett turned and began walking down the ridge toward Magdalena, and the sisters watched until he disappeared among the buildings at the valley floor. "Now what?" Kiona asked. Nahleen pulled out the deed and studied it in the dimming light. According to the crude map sketched on the back, Garrett's land was about 30 miles northwest of Magdalena, tucked into a valley between two mountain ranges. Remote, isolated, exactly what they needed. "Now we find out if we're strong enough to start over," she said. They walked west as the sun set, leaving Magdalena behind. The high country rose before them, dark and forbidding, full of unknown dangers, but also full of possibility. A place where two exiled women might carve out a life on their own terms, beholden to no tribe and no settlement, answerable only to themselves and the land. 3 months later, when the first snow began to fall, Nahleen and Kiona had built a small cabin on Garrett's land and secured enough provisions to survive the winter. They'd made contact with a few other outcasts and wanderers in the territory, people who valued skill and reliability over questions about the past. Word had spread about 2 Apache sisters who could track, hunt, and heal, who traded fairly and kept their promises. They received a letter from Garrett in late autumn, delivered by a prospector passing through. It was brief, written in careful script. He'd reclaimed what remained of his original homestead and was rebuilding. The town had asked questions about his disappearance and miraculous survival, and he'd told them only that strangers had helped him. No names, no details. He understood that some debts could only be honored through silence. The letter ended with a simple sentence. "You gave me back my life. I hope I've given you a chance at yours." Nahleen read it aloud to Kiona by the fire that night, then folded it carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where they kept their mother's turquoise knife and the few other possessions they'd carried into exile. Tokens of who they'd been, who they'd lost, and who they were becoming. Outside, the wind howled through the pines and snow continued to fall, covering the valley in white silence. Inside the cabin, the sisters sat close to the fire and talked about plans for spring. They'd expand the garden, maybe acquire a few chickens, possibly even a cow if they could trade for one. Small ambitions, practical and immediate, the kind of future that could be built one day at a time. When word eventually reached their old tribe about 2 Apache women living alone in the high country, thriving against all odds, Chato sent no message. But years later, during a winter when sickness ravaged the reservation and medicine was scarce, a young runner appeared at their cabin carrying a request. The people needed help. The government doctors had failed them. Would the exiled sisters consider returning just for a season to share their healing knowledge? Nahleen and Kiona looked at each other across their small table, seeing the same question reflected in each other's eyes. Some wounds never fully healed. Some exiles were permanent. But mercy, their mother had taught them, wasn't conditional on forgiveness or acceptance. It was simply what you gave because you had it to give. They packed their medicines and followed the runner south, back toward the land that had rejected them, back toward the people who'd erased their names. They worked for 3 months, tending the sick and teaching younger women the healing arts their mother had passed down. Some refused their help out of old loyalty to the exile. Others accepted it with gratitude. Chato never came to see them, but once Nahleen caught a glimpse of him watching from a distance, his face unreadable. When the sickness finally passed and they prepared to leave, one of the elders approached them with a gift, 2 blankets woven in the traditional patterns, and a quiet acknowledgement that mercy, however inconvenient, was still sacred. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't restoration. But it was recognition that what they'd done, both in saving Garrett and in returning to help their people, had been seen and understood. Nalin and Kiona rode back to their mountain valley carrying those blankets, and when they arrived, they hung them on the cabin walls where they could see them every day. Reminders that exile was a state of being imposed from outside, but identity, real identity, was something you built yourself through every choice, every action, every moment you decided who you wanted to be. Thomas Garrett visited once, years after everything had changed. He brought supplies and news from Magdalena, but mostly he came to see that they were well. He found them expanded beyond the original cabin, with a second structure for storage and a third for guests and trading. They'd built something real in that valley, something that lasted. He stayed only 2 days, understanding without being told that this was their place, not his. But before he left, he stood with Nahlin on the ridge overlooking the valley and said what he'd been carrying since the day they'd saved him. "I never forgot," he said simply, "what you gave up, what it cost." "We know," Nahlin replied. "Does it still hurt?" She considered the question honestly. "Every day. But not as much as it would have hurt to let you die." Garrett nodded slowly. Then he mounted his horse and rode back toward Magdalena, and Nahlin stood watching until he disappeared into the tree line. That evening she and Kiona sat outside the cabin as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Somewhere far to the south, their people were preparing for the evening meal, speaking the language they'd been born into, following the customs they'd been raised to honor. That life was gone, burned away in the moment they'd chosen mercy over loyalty. But here, in this valley they'd claimed for themselves, they'd built something new. Not Apache, not white, but entirely their own. A place where exiles could become something more than the sum of their losses. Where 2 sisters who'd risked everything could finally, impossibly, find peace. Kiona reached over and squeezed Nahlin's hand. "No regrets?" Nahlin squeezed back. "No regrets." They sat together as darkness fell, 2 women who'd saved a life and lost a world, and somehow, against every odd, survived the cost of their own conscience. The stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had guided their ancestors across this land for generations beyond counting. Different names now, different paths. But still the same sky, infinite and enduring, and underneath it all the quiet knowledge that some choices, however devastating their immediate consequences, were still worth making.